Chapter 3. Dan stopped dead in his tracks when both he and Gustavo arrived in front of the recruiting office of the naval base. "What's the matter now?" Gustavo asked, turning to face Dan. "I don't know if I can do this, Gustavo. I'm not sure. What if they say that they've never seen me before?" "And what if they say you're Officer So-and-so and ask if you had a good weekend?" Dan looked up at Gustavo. "I guess there's only one way to find out, isn't there?" "Then let's get in there, okay?" Before leaving on the Tuesday morning, while Malou and her children were sitting having breakfast, Stefano said, "Okay, I've done some research on the internet and I found out that the woods beside our old house in Pennsylvania still exist. So that's where we want to land. Say before the last weekend we should be okay, but the house belongs to some other family now and—" "That doesn't matter, Stefano," Malou interposed. "You see, when we landed in 2000, yes, we went to our house, but once we met with Damianos, he led us to the house at a time it belonged to Solange and Damien. So he should be able to do the same now." "But didn't you say the old Indian told you that you could never go back to the same place?" Gabby asked. "Yes, but what I think he meant was that we couldn't go back to the house in 2000. And that's not what we're intending to do today, is it?" "All right then," Stefano said, getting up. "Are you ready?" He looked at Daniel. "Don't look at me like that. I'm as ready as I'll ever be," Daniel retorted, scraping his chair back from the table. "All right, you two," Malou said. "I don't want any arguing from any of you, understood? We've got a couple of hours driving before we get to Pahokee, so be mindful of what's ahead of us, okay?" Although no longer teenagers, the three children nodded. Mother had spoken. Still apprehensive, Dan let Gustavo enter the office first. The words on the piece of paper he had found at the bottom of his duffel bag rang through his mind, and he couldn't help but feel uncertain. Finding out his name, who he was, and everything he could was of course very important, but somehow knowing was more frightening than being left in the dark about it all. Nevertheless, he stepped toward the desk and riveted his gaze on the uniformed officer behind the counter. He didn't think he had ever met him before today, but that didn't mean a thing under the circumstances. Unexpectedly, the young man stood up and saluted. Dan was floored. He couldn't believe it. The man obviously recognized him, even out of uniform. "At ease, Sergeant," he said, putting his elbows on the counter, suddenly relaxed, as if he had been there every day of late. "I'm just going to show my friend here." He nodded to Gustavo at his side, around the place. "But before I do that, would you have my file handy? I wanted to check something." "Yes, sir, of course, sir," the sergeant said, turning toward a filing cabinet to his left. "Thank you, Sergeant," Dan said, when he had the file in front of him. As soon as he opened it, the flashbacks of his life seemed to pass in front of his mind's eye, as if he were in a movie theatre. His name was Dan Politano, his place of residence was Boca Raton, and he had attended Lynn College in that city, obtaining a bachelor degree in engineering. This allowed him to be automatically engaged as an officer. He was due to commence his piloting training in the next 2 weeks. Closing the file, he said again, "Thank you, Sergeant. I will be back on the 10th then." "Yes, sir, certainly, sir," the officer replied, taking the file from Dan's hands and replacing it in the filing cabinet. "Well?" Gustavo asked as soon as they were outside. "I didn't want to intrude in there, but did you find out who you are then?" Dan nodded, all smiles. Yes, I am Dan Politano, Gustavo. My name is Dan Politano. I do remember my college and my friend Fabio. He is Professor Hugo's son, and apparently, according to the file, he enlisted with me." "Wow, but hold on a little minute. So I was right, you did go to college, didn't you?" "Yes, Gustavo, I must have come here with Fabio for some reason, which still eludes me, and then something happened. I don't recall everything yet, but as soon as I know who I am and where I live, and the other thing I found out was that I am due to start training in 2 weeks' time, which means I'll have to go home and find out what happened. I don't know, maybe my family is searching for me." The note in his jeans pocket made sense now. He was to meet Fabio on the 10th in the hangar. Which hangar, he still didn't know, but that was a detail. "I am still broke, but would you mind if we went for a pizza somewhere to celebrate?" "A pizza? What on earth would you want to eat a pizza for?" "I don't know, Gustavo, but I feel like it. How about it?" "Okay, a pizza it is then." When they reached Pahokee, Malou slowed down and pointed to St. Mary's Church. "That's the church where your dad and I went through our first task." "What was that task about?" Daniel asked. "Tolerance. The priest showed us images of despots and tyrants who were cruel and intolerant toward their own people." "It was like showing you the reverse of the coin," Gabby remarked. "Exactly. By showing us how intolerant human beings could be, we understood the importance of tolerance toward our fellow man." "So you came back here during your journey?" Stefano queried. Malou shook her head. "No, not exactly. Damianos managed to transport the church from here to Pennsylvania." "Neat," Daniel exclaimed. "Can hardly wait to meet the man. Sounds like my kind of people." "Cat, Daniel," Gabby corrected. He's a cat, remember? Looking in the rearview mirror at her son, Malou smiled and said, Anyway, whatever he is, if he's here, you'll see him as soon as we get to the hotel. A few minutes later, Malou parked the car by the curb near the Seminole Indian. The old man hardly raised his gaze to her as she climbed out from behind the wheel, but smiled. Stefano, Daniel and Gabby gathered around their mother while shooting furtive glances at the black cat, with a patch of white on the top of its head. The animal was lying on the windowsill, impassible, but watching the four visitors carefully, it seemed. You remember me? Malou asked, bending down to the old Indian.
Oh, yes, Mrs. Politano, I do, he replied, putting the amulet he had been carving on the table beside him. And you have come with your children to take another trip into the past, have you not?
Yes, we have, but before we do, could we talk to your cat?
If you like to do that, I'm sure he would listen to you, but he will not respond. Of course you realize that, I'm sure.
Okay then, and thank you, Malou replied, turning her gaze to Damianos. I'm sure you're aware that Dan is lost in his past. Our children and I need to find him, Damianos, and since you told us that you would be there if we needed your help, we are here to ask you to come with us in our search. An almost inaudible purr and a paw passing over his eyes and nose was the only answer Malou got to her request. Yet for her, it had been all she wanted to reassure her that Damianos would be there on the other side of the painting. As if mesmerized by Damianos' green, vibrant eyes, Gabby had a hard time looking away from him when her mother grabbed her arm and led her to the paintings leaning against the wall beside the old Indian's chair.
I was expecting you to return, the latter said, standing beside Malou now. I believe this is where you wish to return.
He pointed to a painting depicting a forest clearing and a small log cabin in the background. Yes, absolutely, Malou blurted. But how did you know? The old Seminole chuckled, although his sad eyes didn't show the hilarity he expressed.
A little bird told me, as you people say.
This looks like a beautiful place, Gabby remarked from over her mother's shoulder. Yes, it is, Gabby, Malou replied. Are we going to find Damianos in that cabin? Daniel asked, determined as ever, it seemed, to meet the man and not the cat. Well, we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? Stefano said, looking at his brother, a frown crossing his brow.
Okay, then, the old man said. Come with me first. You need to buy your dream catchers and listen to my instructions before you leave.
You mean you've got to wear that silly thing around our neck? Stefano was about to grab his brother by the shoulders to throw him in the gutter when Malou intervened. You're both behaving like kids, and I won't have it. Is that understood? And as for you, Daniel, everything you will see or hear during this journey may be the strangest or silliest things you've ever experienced in your life, but I warn you, God will be watching, and I or Stefano won't be the ones correcting your errors. Stefano pulled his wallet out of his jeans pocket and paid the old man $15 for the 3 dream catchers that he, Daniel and Gabby would need to wear during their journey. Don't I need a new one? Malou asked, looking down at her own amulet.
No, Mrs. Politano, you don't. You need only one dream catcher for your entire life. Keep it around your neck, all of you, and it will protect you.
He looked at the 3 children each in turn as they passed the leather strap around their heads.
Now, as I told your parents before they took their first trip, you will need to hold hands to enter the painting and do the same when you return. You have 7 days to spend in your past. On the 7th day, you need to return to the exact spot where you landed. Hold hands and return here to the time you left. If you stay longer than 7 days, you will not be able to come back. If you should lose your dream catcher, not only will you expose yourselves to grave danger, but you will not be able to come back.
What if we get separated while we search for our dad? What happens then? Stefano asked.
Nothing will happen unless you are not at the spot where you landed before the 7th day has elapsed.
And if we don't hold hands on the way in or on the way back, you know what could happen, don't you, Daniel? Gabby was glaring at her brother. All right, I'm not a child anymore, okay? Daniel blurted. Then stop acting like one, Stefano rejoined.
Are we all set then?
The old Indian asked. As we will ever be, Malou replied, going to stand in front of the painting, Gabby and Daniel to her right and Stefano to her left, 4 of them holding hands. Such as Malou felt on their first trip into their past with Dan, they began to feel lighter, and lights began to flash back and forth, along with fog and winds blowing from different directions. Then all of a sudden, everything stopped.